Short Lives of the Dominican Saints, Part 8. May 27th. Blessed Peter Sanz and his companions, martyrs. 1747 to 1748. To the order of friars preachers, according to the testimony of Pope Benedict XIV, belongs the glory of having been the first to send missionaries to China, and to water that ungrateful soil with the blood of martyrs. It is no part of our present task to describe the apostolic labors of the sons of St. Dominic in that far-off portion of the Master's vineyard. We can only here give a brief sketch of the life and martyrdom of the 5 Spanish friars who have recently received the honors of beatification at the hands of Pope Leo XIII, but who were by no means the first of their brethren to shed their blood for the faith in China. The Blessed Fathers, Peter Martyr Sanz, Francis Serrano, John Alcober, Joachim Royo, and Francis Diaz, were all born towards the close of the 17th or at the beginning of the 18th century. They all received the habit of St. Dominic at a very early age in various convents of their native land, showed themselves to be models of every religious virtue, and at their own earnest request were successively sent on the Chinese mission, the province of Fo-Kien becoming the scene of their labors. The apostolate of Blessed Peter Sanz began in 715, and in 1730 he was consecrated Bishop of Moricastrum in partibus infidelium. Blessed Joachim Royal was only 23 when he landed in China and was ordained priest on the soil, which, after more than 30 years of fruitful labor, he was to water with his blood. Some very interesting particulars have been preserved regarding the vocation of Blessed John Alcober. The Chinese mission seems early to have occupied his mind, but the extraordinary success which he attended his preaching in his native land for a time damped the ardor of his desires, until it was rekindled in a wonderful manner. One day in Lent, in the midst of an impassioned appeal to the hearts of sinners, Blessed John seized a large crucifix, and holding it up before the people, exclaimed, as though speaking in the person of Christ, "How long, O ye sons of men, will you be heavy of heart? How long, ye sinners, will you remain hardened?" Then it pleased his divine Master to speak to him in a clear voice from the crucifix, saying, "And thou, John, how long?" The words were heard by himself alone, but his astonished audience was witness of the deep emotion of the preacher, who was obliged at once to leave the pulpit. Our Lord's tender reproach did not fall unheeded on his ears, and the close of 1726 found him in China, where he had recourse to the most ingenious devices to gain access to the Christians in the midst of the persecution which was then raging. Blessed Francis Diaz was by far the youngest of the heroic band, and concerning him also some edifying details have come down to us. To his father's earnest entreaties, he would take possession of a family benefice which had fallen vacant when he was still a mere boy. He replied, "Urge me no more, father. The riches and comforts of life are nothing to me. I shall consecrate myself to God in the order of St. Dominic as soon as I am old enough. I shall join the fathers who volunteer for the Philippines, and I shall shed my blood for Jesus Christ in China." On the news of his martyrdom being brought to his father, the old man, in the midst of his tears and thanksgiving, related this incident. When a fresh persecution unexpectedly broke out in the year 1746, 3 of the missionaries were soon seized, imprisoned, and cruelly tormented to make themselves reveal the hiding place of the bishop, Father Peter Sanz, and of Father Royo. On hearing this, the 2 thus sought after voluntarily surrendering themselves, in the vain hope of saving their brethren. All 5 were immediately dragged to Fo Chio, where they were thrown into separate prisons, and at various times examined and put to the most cruel torments. Astonished at their unalterable patience, the pagans asked them if they felt no pain. "Indeed I do," replied the venerable bishop, "but I think of my Saviour's sufferings." During the whole of his captivity, which lasted several months, the holy old man faithfully observed the rule of his order and rose at midnight to recite his rosary, being no longer able to say the divine office, as his breviary had been taken from him. He was the first of the little band to receive the crown of martyrdom, being beheaded on May 26th, 1747, whilst his afflicted flock were reciting the rosary for him. The other 4 confessors of the faith bore their prolonged imprisonment with equal cheerfulness, and ceased not to labor for the salvation of souls even to the end. It was in this dark dungeon and into his chained hands that Blessed Francis Serrano received the bulls, whereas Pope Benedict XIV appointed him coadjutor to Bishop Sanz, with the title of Bishop of Tipaza, and pro-vicar apostate of Fo Kien. He did not, however, live to receive the episcopal consecration, being honored instead with the martyr's crown, which he obtained, together with his 3 companions, on October 28th, 1748. Blessed Francis Serrano and Blessed Joachim Royo were stifled in a horrible manner in their prison, while Blessed John Alcober and Blessed Francis Diaz were strangled. The relics of the martyrs were gathered up by the faithful, and portions of them were subsequently brought to Europe. May 28th. Blessed Maria Bartolomeo Bagnesi, Virgin, 1514 to 1577. Maria Bartolomeo Bagnesi was born in Florence of noble parents on the feast of St. Bartholomew, 1514. From her earliest childhood she gave token of her future sanctity, continually repeating, "I will have no other spouse than Jesus." 4 of her elder sisters having become nuns and others being married, Maria had to assume the management of the house while still a mere girl. But in spite of the manifold duties which devolved upon her, and which she discharged with marvelous prudence and success, she never neglected any of her exercises of piety. Her father determined to give her in marriage to one of the many suitors who sought her hand, but at the bare mention of an earthly alliance, Maria fell to the ground, stricken in all her limbs with a strange weakness, and she was confined to her bed during the remaining 45 years of her life, except for a brief interval after her profession as a Dominican tertiary. She was able to visit the church of Santa Maria Novella and some of the convents of the city. Her bodily sufferings were excruciating and always redoubled in violence on occasion of the great festivals of the church. Satan was also permitted to visit her with violent temptations and trying scruples, But she bore all with heroic patience and with a countenance radiant with joy. She could not bear to see anyone look sad or downcast. "Why are you so sad?" she would say to such persons. "Fulfill all your duties with fidelity, and Jesus, who is perfect joy, will come into your heart and will make it leap for gladness." Her family fell into straitened circumstances, and the 24 years Blessed Maria had to endure a cruel domestic persecution from a servant who tyrannized over her afflicted mistress in the most heartless manner. But the servant of God bore all with perfect sweetness. A true daughter of Saint Dominic, she ceased not to labor for souls, not only by her prayers and sufferings and penitential exercises, but also by her wise counsels. Multitudes flocked to pour out to her the trials and difficulties, and no one left her unconsoled. She had contrived to convert her sick room into a sort of chapel, where the holy sacrifice was almost daily offered, and, though usually unable to move, she might often be seen during Mass raised in ecstasy, remaining sometimes for a long space with her arms outstretched in the form of a cross. She went to confession every day, and during the last years of her life was refreshed almost daily with the bread of angels. Her happy death took place on Whit Tuesday, 1577. Her holy remains were laid to rest, according to her own desire, in a church attached to the Carmelite convent of St. Mary of the Angels, where she was held in great veneration. 7 years later, St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, then a young religious in that convent, was miraculously cured of a dangerous illness through the intercession of Blessed Maria, to whom she afterwards bore a singular devotion. One day our Lord showed her Blessed Maria outside beside St. Catherine of Siena in glory, and even raised somewhat higher than that great saint, a circumstance which he explained by saying that Blessed Maria had labored and suffered for the salvation of souls during a much longer space of time than St. Catherine, who died at the early age of 33. On another occasion, the holy Carmelite beheld Blessed Maria holding in her hand some garments of exquisite whiteness, destined for those of her clients who were desirous of being clothed with purity of heart. She appears to apply these garments to the open side of our Lord, when they assumed various hues in conformity with the special needs of the souls for whom they were intended, whether of humility, charity, or penance. Blessed Maria seemed to take the hearts of some of her clients as though to cleanse them. The hearts of some she opened, in order to render them more capable of receiving the precious blood. But she did this for those souls who only had earnestly begged this favor of her. It was revealed to St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi that Blessed Maria thus served as a channel of heavenly graces by reason of her admirable purity. This special model of the sick and suffering was raised to the altars of the Church by Pope Pius VII. Her body, which is perfectly incorrupt, reposes at Florence, under a side altar in the convent church of St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, whither the Carmelite nuns have been obliged to remove from their convent of St. Mary of the Angels. May 29th. Blessed William and his companions, the martyrs of Avignon, 1242. The martyrs of Avignon were of the number of those who fell victims to the cruelty of the Albigenses in the south of France in the 13th century. In 1234, Blessed William Arnauld was appointed by Pope Gregory IX. Inquisitor of the Faith for the Diocese of Toulouse, Albi, Carcassonne, and Agen, the very territory which had been the scene of the labors of his holy patriarch, Saint Dominic, some 20 years previously. Blessed William's zeal in the discharge of his duties drew down upon him the special hatred of the heretics. He and his brethren were for a time driven from their convent at Toulouse. They soon returned, however, and devoted themselves with renewed energy to their apostolic work, which was destined to win for some amongst them the glorious crown of martyrdom. A few days before this happy consummation of their labors, it pleased God to reveal the coming event of a Holy Father who was praying in the convent at Bordeaux. He held in his vision our crucified Savior, and our Blessed Lady receiving in a gold chalice the blood which was streaming from the wounds of her divine Son. Then, raising the chalice, she poured its contents on 3 religious, clad in the Dominican habit, who were humbly kneeling at her feet. A similar revelation was made to one of the future martyrs, a Franciscan, Blessed Raymond Carbonet, who beheld descending from heaven a beautiful and radiant crown adorned with 11 precious stones. This crown hung in the air over the building at Avignon, which the martyrs were afterwards attacked. Blessed Raymond had no difficulty in understanding the meaning of the vision, and hastened to communicate the tidings to Blessed William, who was at that head of the mission. The Holy Inquisitor, who was at Proil at the time, listened attentively to the story, and then cried out to his companions, "Know, my brethren, that in a few days' time we shall be martyred for the faith of Jesus Christ." Then he immediately set out for Avignon, a small town a few miles distant from Toulouse, at the head of his little company, which consisted of Blessed Bernard of Rochefort, a friar preacher, Blessed Garcia of Auray, a Dominican lay brother, 2 Franciscans, the prior of the monastery of Saint Benedict at Avignon, Raymond, archdeacon of the church of Toulouse, Bernard, a cleric of the same church, 2 other clerics who acted as messengers, and a layman, a notary of the name of Peter. On reaching their destination, the missionaries began to preach with greater ardor than ever, and the enraged heretics met together and plotted their destruction. Raymond of Alfaro, an infamous man, who then ruled Avignon in the name of the Count of Toulouse, invited the holy men into his castle under pretext of friendship and reconciliation. When the 11 were assembled in a large hall which was used for administering justice, assassins who had already been concealed on the premises broke in upon them. The servants of God did not attempt to escape. Kneeling down, they intoned the Te Deum, and ceased not to sing till their voices were hushed in death. Some of the Catholics of the place managed, at the risk of their lives, to drag Blessed William Arnauld and the Franciscan, Blessed Stephen of Narbonne, into the parish church, and claimed for them the privilege of sanctuary. But the infuriated heretics burst into the sacred edifice and struck their victims to the ground with redoubled blows, even carrying their cruelty so far as to tear out the tongue of Blessed William, by whose eloquence he had been so often been put to confusion. This glorious martyrdom took place on the eve of the Ascension, May 29th, 1242. Miraculous lights revealed to the Catholics the spots where the mangled remains had been thrown by the heretics, and made known far and near the triumph of the martyrs, and many miracles were worked by their intercession. The parish church at Avignone, in which the crime had been consummated, remained under interdict for the space of 40 years. At the end of that time, the Albigensian heresy had almost entirely disappeared, and the people applied to Rome for permission to reopen the building. It was granted, and on the very day appointed for the solemn rite of reconciliation, the doors of the church, which had been closed with immense iron bars, broke open of themselves, and the bells, so long silent, rang out of their own accord, and continued to ring during an entire day and night. On entering the church, the people found within it a beautiful statue of the Blessed Virgin, which had never been seen there before, and which is held in veneration even to our own day. And later on, a confraternity was established in honor of Our Lady of Avignone. The principal festival of this confraternity is on the first Tuesday in June, and on that day a touching ceremony takes place, called the Vow of Avignone, said to owe its origin to a vow made by the inhabitants on occasion of the reopening of the church. Persons of all ranks may be seen, holding lighted tapers in their hands, dragging themselves on their knees from the miraculous statue which stands at the bottom of the church to the steps of the sanctuary, where, over the high altar, hangs a picture representing the death of the martyrs. This ceremony is intended as a solemn act of reparation towards our Blessed Lady, so horribly blasphemed by the heretics, and towards the holy martyrs, whose blood was shed on that spot. The martyrs of Avignone were beatified by Pius IX. May 31st. Blessed James of Salomonio, Confessor, 1231 to 1314. Blessed James was born of rich and noble parents at Venice in the year 1231. His father died shortly after his birth, and his mother retired into a convent, entrusting the care of the child to his paternal grandmother, a holy widow, who brought him up very piously. A pretty and significant story is told of the early childhood of the little James. His grandmother once promised him some great reward if he would recite the little office of Our Blessed Lady for 100 consecutive days. At the end of the time the child appeared and claimed his promised reward. He received, however, nothing but a caress and a few words of praise, and his hoped-for treat was withheld or forgotten. The circumstance made a deep impression on his mind. He made a resolution to turn his back on human motives and human rewards, and continue to say the office daily, not to please any earthly friend, but for the sole object of serving God and his Blessed Mother. His patrimony, of which he was entire master, was very large, and he literally fulfilled our Lord's exhortation to the rich young man in the Gospel by distributing the whole of it to the poor. He then presented himself at the Dominican convent of Saints John and Paul, where he received the habit on his 17th birthday. Finding, however, that the visits of his relatives were a source of some distraction, after 20 years, he obtained leave from his superiors to remove to the convent of Forli, and there he spent the remainder of his long religious life, with the exception of the intervals passed at Faenza, San Severino, and Ravenna, where he filled the office of sub-prior. The sanctity of Blessed James manifested itself chiefly in the perfection with which he observed his religious rule. It was his constant study, and on his deathbed he mentioned as a subject for special thankfulness that during 25 consecutive years he had not above 5 times drunk between meals, words which revealed also his spirit of mortification. As in the hot climate of Italy, thirst is a far more frequent and painful source of suffering than in our northern land. It had evidently been the great thought of his life to sanctify himself through his rule. We read also of his never being absent from the choral recitation of the divine office, either by day or by night, and of the singular beauty of his manner of discharging his choir duties, being a master in the art of chanting. Blessed James had a special devotion to the recital of the offices of those saints who were not commemorated by the universal Church. 2 holy martyrs, Saint Ecclesiastes and Victoria, are venerated at Cordova, where a miracle is believed to be annually renewed in their honor. Their festival falls on the 17th of November, and on that day fresh and beautiful roses are said always to blossom on the scene of their martyrdom. These saints are, however, little known save in Cordova. Blessed James loved to venerate them, and once, when he was walking in the country on their feast day, meditating on their sufferings, a rose of exquisite beauty and fragrance suddenly bloomed before him, doubtless sent as a token of the divine approval of his veneration for these blessed martyrs. He made a pilgrimage to Rome to visit the many sanctuaries of the Eternal City. One day, going to St. Sebastian's, the sacristan who kept the keys of the catacombs was not to be found. But after praying for a few moments, Blessed James touched the iron bar, which was fastened by a padlock. The gates instantly opened of themselves, and he and his companions were enabled to satisfy their devotion. He had an earnest desire to say Mass in the chapel of the Scala Santa, known as the Sancta Sanctorum. As many most precious relics were preserved in this chapel, strangers were hardly ever permitted to celebrate there, and Blessed James was told that his desire was an impossible one, since he was but a poor unknown friar. Trusting in the goodness of God, however, he went one morning to pray in this sanctuary, having purposely omitted to say Mass before leaving his convent. As he entered, he was accosted by the sacristan, who asked him if he were a priest and whether he had yet said Mass. On receiving his reply, "Then I pray you," said the sacristan, "to say it in the Sancta Sanctorum, for the priest who should by rights have done so has been prevented." Then Blessed James very gladly said his Mass, receiving a very great consolation and thanking God for his wonderful goodness. The fame of Blessed James as a confessor was very great, both among his brethren and seculars. He was commonly called the Father of the Poor, and showed himself a wonderful consoler of the afflicted, to whom he was wont to say, "If you only knew how profitable sufferings are, you would ask our Lord to increase your sufferings, together with his grace." During the last 4 years of his life he suffered from a terrible cancer, which caused him excruciating pain, but which for several months he kept concealed from the knowledge of all. He said his office even to the last day of his life, and breathed forth his holy soul to God on the 31st of May, 1314, at the age of 83, having spent 66 years in the religious life. He worked many miracles, both during his life and after his death, and the veneration paid to him was approved by Clement VII in 1526, and also by subsequent pontiffs. June 1st. Blessed Alfonso Navarrete and his companions, the martyrs of Japan, 1614 to 1643. On July 7th, 1867, just after the celebration of the 18th centenary of the martyrdoms of St. Peter and Paul, Pope Pius IX solemnly beatified 205 martyrs who had suffered for the faith in Japan at various dates during the persecution which raged in that country between 1614 and 1643. 59 of these blessed martyrs belonged to the order of St. Dominic. Of these, some were European missionaries, for the most part Spaniards from the Philippine Islands, other native friars, and other again tertiaries. 58 more were members of the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary. There were also Jesuits, Franciscans, and Augustinians, and numbers of native converts. The first Dominican who laid down his life for the faith in this persecution was the Blessed Father Alfonso Navarrete, who, for his heroic deeds of charity, have been termed the St. Vincent de Paul of Japan. He was captured by the pagans when on his way to succor the afflicted Christians of Omura, an act which was equivalent to offering himself for martyrdom. After dragging him from one desert island to another, in order to find some spot where his execution might take place unknown to the Christians, the soldiers at length struck off his head as he knelt in prayer, holding his rosary and blessed candle in one hand and a wooden cross in the other. His martyrdom took place on June 1st, 1617. During the 5 years which ensued, numbers of missionaries and of native Christians fell into the hands of the persecutors, and were at length all imprisoned together at Omura. There were 9 Dominicans, 9 Franciscans, 9 Jesuits, among whom was the famous Father Charles Spinola, and a few seculars. During their long and painful captivity, they kept up all the exercises of community life, rising at midnight to recite their office, and celebrating as many masses as they could at daybreak. They also imposed on themselves many fasts and other austerities, in addition to the sufferings which they had to undergo in their wretched prison. Yet so full of joy were they at the thought of the suffering for the name of Christ, that Father Alfonso de Mena, of the order of St. Dominic, used to date his letters, "From this prison of Omura, the paradise of my delights." On September 9th, 1622, 24 of the prisoners were removed to Nagasaki, and on the following day were led out to the holy hill consecrated 25 years before by the crucifixion of the 26 canonized martyrs of Japan, a Christian went before them, bearing the banner of the confraternity of the Holy Name, whilst they followed joyfully, singing the litanies and the Te Deum. Father Joseph of St. Hyacinth addressed the crowds who had gathered together to witness the scene, exhorting them to be faithful to the devotion of the Holy Rosary, which would continue to instruct them when their pastors should be no more. A stake was prepared for each of the martyrs, the horrible death of burning having been assigned to several of them. Another procession of native Christians from Nagasaki now joined them, clad in robes of ceremony and preceded by a Dominican tertiary, clothed in the habit of the order and carrying a cross. Some of them bore their little children in their arms. The victims numbered upward to 50. About half of them were sentenced to be burnt, and the rest beheaded. The former were fastened to their stakes in such a way as to allow of their escaping, should they choose to save their lives by apostasy. The fire was applied slowly, so as to prolong their agony, but only 2 of the heroic company evinced any sign of being conscious of their sufferings. Both of them were young Japanese, and implored the governor to grant them a quicker death. But the boon was denied, and Blessed Paul Nangaski, a Dominican tertiary, left his stake to lead them back to the altar of sacrifice. The Blessed Father Angelo Ferrer Orsucci was seen to rise gradually in a kneeling position several feet above the flames, and thus continued for some time in ecstasy. One by one the martyrs passed to their reward. The Blessed Father Hyacinth Orfanel lingered in agony for 16 hours, expiring at length with the names of Jesus and Mary on his lips. This martyrdom is known in the history as the Great Martyrdom. All the religious orders in Japan shared the triumph, but that of St. Dominic was most numerously represented, offering to God on that day 5 of its priests and 3 professed brothers, besides numbers of tertiaries and members of the confraternity of the Rosary. A few weeks previously, the Blessed Father Louis Flores, who had been executed at the instigation of the Dutch on August 19th, and 2 days after the great martyrdom, 3 more Dominicans suffered death by fire. In the following year, 1623, on the 25th of August, the Blessed Father Peter Vasquez was burnt in the company with 4 companions, singing the litanies in the midst of the flames. On July 26, 1627, Blessed Father Louis Bertrand, cousin and namesake of the great Louis Bertrand, was burned with 2 native friars preachers. Next year, the Blessed Father Dominic Castelli shared the same fate, in the company of 2 Dominican lay brothers and 2 Franciscans. So fiercely did the persecution rage, and so fiendish were the measures taken for preventing the landing of fresh missionaries in the country, that at length the Japanese Christians were left without pastors and continued in that condition for 200 years. Nevertheless, when, in our own days, the long-closed empire became once more accessible to Europeans, it was found to contain a considerable number of Christians who had preserved the form of baptism with the utmost accuracy, were well instructed in the essential doctrines of religion, and familiar with many of the prayers in common use among the faithful, and who still cherished with great veneration a picture representing the 15 mysteries of the Rosary. What stronger testimony can be alleged to the truth of the Catholic Church, which could thus sustain its life, drawn from a divine source, under the circumstances that must have crushed any religion of human origin? June 2nd. Blessed Sadek and his companions, the martyrs of Sandomir, 1260. Throughout the whole of his apostolic career, the desire which lay nearest to the heart of St. Dominic appears to have been that of devoting himself to the conversion of the Cumans, a savage horde who had established themselves in northeast of Hungary. It was not God's will, however, that the father and founder of the Friars' Preacher should carry the light of faith to these poor barbarians. The work which he was not permitted himself to undertake was reserved for his sons. In the general chapter of 1221, held only a week before the death of the saint, Father Paul of Hungary, who had recently joined the ranks of his disciples, was dispatched to found the order in the lands bordering on the Danube, having as his companions Blessed Sadek, who was of Slavonic origin, and 3 others. When they reached the confines of Hungary, Blessed Sadek, praying during the night, as was his custom, for the extension of the order and the success of their mission, saw himself surrounded by a troop of demons, who cried out, "Woe to us! You are come to snatch from us our rights, to drive us from our possessions." Then, pointing to the young novices recruited on the way, the infernal visitants exclaimed in despairing accents, "And must it be by mere children like these? Oh, what confusion!" Father Paul eventually realized his holy patriarch's desire, and won a martyr's crown among the Cumans. And Blessed Sadek, who had shared his labors for several years, became prior of the convent of Sandomir in Poland. In the year 1260 this town was attacked by a fierce horde of Tartars, led on and encouraged by those inveterate enemies of the Polish nation, the Russians, who, finding the place strongly defended and almost impregnable, treacherously proposed a suspension of hostilities. During the night previous to this truce, the community had assembled to sing matins and lauds. During the conclusion of the office, one of the novices, going out according to custom into the middle of the choir to sing the martyrology, that is, the list of the saints to be commemorated on the morrow, saw in the place of the book where he should begin these words in letters of gold: "At Sandomir the passion of 49 martyrs." The novice was greatly perplexed at the sight. Nevertheless he mastered his emotion, and, to use the words of the old chronicler, sang with the simplicity of a dove and the voice of a swan, sang out to the brethren the words which he saw before him. The astonished prior desired the novice to bring the book to him, and the miraculous inscription was distinctly seen by the entire community. Then the holy prior, filled with the Spirit of God, counted his friars, and found that with himself they numbered exactly 49. "Brethren," he exclaimed, "these words are for us. It is the Tartars who will open for us the gates of heaven, and that tomorrow. Now, therefore, all that remains for us to do is to prepare by confession and by devout reception of the bread of angels for our happy martyrdom. The religious listened to him with tears of joy and thankfulness. Not knowing when the destined hour might be, they immediately got ready for confession, and spent the remainder of the night in prayer, and in calm preparation for the morning's communion and for a holy death. At daybreak they all approached the holy table, with a wonderful peace in their breasts, knowing that to them it was indeed to be a viaticum. As the day wore on and no signs of the expected barbarians appeared, they fulfilled their accustomed offices and duties, yet with a sweet impatience for the hour of deliverance. At length, at the hour of compline, they went to the choir to offer up the last act of worship they should be called on to render in this life. They sang that office with unusual solemnity and gladness, and at its conclusion went out into the body of the church in procession, as in the manner is in our order, to sing the Salve. As they were sweetly intoning this antiphon to the Blessed Mother of God, a band of Tartars, traitorously admitted into the city by the treacherous Russians, burst into the church and cut them all to pieces. One of the friars was seized with the impulse to flee, and succeeded in hiding himself in the belfry, but, we quote again from the old chronicle, perceiving that the mangled bodies of his companions, whose souls were now singing hallelujahs in heaven, continued, though dead, to chant that sweet melody of the Salve, he regained courage, offered himself of his own accord to the swords of the barbarians, and went to join his fortunate brethren in the courts of paradise. Thus they died, like heavenly swans, whose death songs were the sweet praises of their mother Mary, and doubtless her virginal hands were lovingly crowned them with the garland of immortality. From this time the custom was introduced into the order of singing the Salve at the deathbed of its members, in order to beseech Mary to change the labors and trials of this vale of tears into the eternal possession of the blessed fruit of her womb. The blessed martyrs were beatified by Pius VII. June 4th. Translation of the relics of St. Peter, Martyr, 1340. After the death of his glorious champion of the faith, heaven was pleased to attest his sanctity by countless miracles in every part of Christendom, and the sovereign pontiffs vied with each other in doing honor to his memory. The first translation of his holy remains took place during the provincial chapter within a year of his martyrdom. The body on this, as well as on subsequent occasions, was found perfectly incorrupt. It was laid in a sarcophagus, the gift of the abbot of San Simpliciano, who had not forgotten the words pronounced by the saint a few years previously, when, pointing out the block of marble of which it was made, he had said, "That would make a famous tomb for a martyr." The municipality of Milan surrounded the shrine with a balustrade of exquisite workmanship. When St. Thomas Aquinas passed through Milan in the year 1262, he wrote an epitaph in verse which was engraved on marble by the side of the martyr's tomb. A yet more splendid shrine, a masterpiece of sculpture, carved by Balducci of Pisa, out of white Carrara marble, supported on 8 pilasters of red Verona marble, was raised to the honor of the champion of the faith in the following century, and the sacred remains were transferred to it during the general chapter held in Milan in the year 1340. Many miracles were worked on this occasion, and the fathers of the order very reluctantly yielded to the request of John Visconti, Archbishop of Milan, and gave him the head of the holy martyr, which he enclosed in a silver tabernacle. Not long after, the prelate was seized with violent pain in the head, which no remedy could relieve. The friars were not slow to put their own interpretation on this circumstance. They told the archbishop that St. Peter wished that his head should be restored to the keeping of his own brethren, and this was accordingly done. The saint himself appeared to a pious Florentine resident in Milan, and bade him build a chapel wherein his head might be kept in great veneration. His commands were obeyed, and a significant chapel was erected adjoining the apse in the Dominican church at San Istorgio, where the body of the martyr reposed. Some alterations in the church necessitated a fresh translation of the sacred remains in the year 1736. They were then removed to the chapel which had been built, as we have seen, for the reception of the head. In our own day, St. Eustorgio has, alas, been taken away from the order and has become an ordinary parish church. June 9th. Blessed Diana, Cecilia, and Amata, virgins, 13th century. On this day are jointly commemorated three of our Holy Father St. Dominic's eldest spiritual daughters, who appear to have been singularly dear to him. Blessed Diana was a member of the noble family of D'Angelo, and was she who persuaded her father and grandfather to make over to the friars preacher their rights over the church of St. Nicholas at Bologna, and to give them land for the site of a convent. Despising the pomps and vanities of the world, she placed herself under the spiritual direction of Blessed Reginald, who, on his departure for Paris, confided her to the care of the Holy Patriarch, St. Dominic, and in his presence and that of Blessed Reginald, Blessed Guala, the community of St. Nicholas, and many noble ladies of Bologna, Diana bound herself by the vows of religion, though permitted for a time to remain in her father's house. There she led a life of penance and devotion, earnestly longing for the day when a convent for religious women of the order should be founded in her native city. St. Dominic entrusted the execution of this design to four of the principal fathers at Bologna, charging them to begin it without waiting for the completion of their own priory. Many difficulties, however, arose, and Blessed Diana had to encounter the most determined opposition on the part of her family. She fled for refuge to a neighboring monastery, whence she was dragged with such violence as to fracture one of her ribs. After remaining a prisoner in her father's house for nearly a year, during which St. Dominic consoled her by his letters, she again escaped to the same convent, where this time she was suffered to remain until the new convent of St. Agnes was ready for her reception. This was not until after the death of St. Dominic. During the octave of the Ascension, 1223, Blessed Jordan, who had succeeded our Holy Father in the government of the order, installed Blessed Diana and some of the other noble maidens of Bologna in their new home. And a few weeks later, on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, he gave them the habit and afterwards admitted them to profession. To train them in religious life and in the ceremonies of the order, he summoned 4 of the nuns from St. Sixtus in Rome, and among them the Blessed Cecilia and Amata, the former of whom belonged to the noble family of the Cesarini, had joined the community in the Trastevere, which our Holy Father was commissioned to reform. When they were transferred to the convent of St. Sixtus, Cecilia, then only 17, was the first to throw herself at the feet of the saint to beg for the habit of the order. She now, at the age of 23, became the first prioress of the new monastery at Bologna. Of her companion, Blessed Amy or Amata, no particulars have been preserved. Some authors have believed her to be identical with the possessed woman who disturbed St. Dominic's sermon at St. Sixtus a few days after the profession of the nuns, and who was by him delivered from her tormentor and admitted into the community, the saint himself bestowing on her the sweet name of Amata, or the beloved. But as it had been proved that this sister went on pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela, at a date when the 4 sisters from St. Sixtus were already settled at Bologna, the theory in question is untenable. Blessed Jordan watched with paternal tenderness over the young community at St. Agnes's, whose fervor in penitential exercises he found himself obliged to moderate. He often consoled them by his letters, and commended himself and the success of his preaching to their prayers. Blessed Diana lived in the order for 13 years, in great humility and love of poverty, and in such fervor of spirit as frequently by her burning words to move the sisters to tears of devotion. She happily departed to her spouse on the 10th of June, 1236. Blessed Cecilia lived to an extreme old age. To her we are indebted for a most graphic and beautiful account of our Holy Father's life at St. Sixtus and Santa Sabina. She died in the odor of sanctity in 1290, and was buried in the same tomb with Blessed Diana and Amata. Their remains have been twice discovered and honorably translated. Pope Leo XIII has approved of the veneration paid to these holy virgins, and given permission for their Mass and office to be celebrated in the Archdiocese of Bologna and throughout the Dominican order.